The sun bled out across the West Texas horizon, a messy, glorious wound of crimson and gold that painted the underside of the vast, empty sky. Down below, the land was less forgiving. It was a place of cracked earth and thirsty mesquite, where the wind was the only constant companion, and it spoke in a lonesome moan that promised nothing but more dust and more distance. The red dirt, fine as flour, rose in ghostly plumes with every gust, coating everything in a thin, rust-colored film. The skeletal ribs of a long-dead steer, the weathered gray planks of a solitary farmhouse, and the woman who stood on its porch. Her name was Clara, and she was 30 years old, though some days she felt a century had passed over her. She wore the uniform of her station, a severe black dress, its fabric worn thin at the elbows and cuffs, a cage of dark cotton that had been her skin for the year since her husband's death. She stood motionless, a statue carved from grief and patience, looking out at the endless expanse where the earth met the sky. In her hand, she clutched a single piece of paper, folded and unfolded so many times the creases were like veins, the paper itself worn soft as doe skin. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. Her gaze was fixed on that vanishing point, that place where memory lived. It was on a day just like this, with the sun burning down the sky, that she had last seen Eli. He hadn't been the grim, hard man the world had tried to make him into. Not yet. He had been all easy confidence and laughter that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. He smelled of leather, sweat, and the wild sage he'd ridden through. He had taken her hands, strong, calloused hands that could gentle a wild horse or fix a broken wagon wheel, and made her a promise as vast and real as the land itself. "Wait for me, Clarabelle," he'd said, his voice a low rumble that sent a tremor straight to her soul. "When I get back from this cattle drive, I'm buying the ring, and then this whole damn county will know you're mine." She had waited, but he never came back from that drive. Instead, word had come, carried on the cruel tongues of gossip and righteous accusation. Rustling. A deputy shot. Eli's name was dragged through the mud, twisted into something ugly and criminal. She saw him one last time, in shackles, his face bruised but his eyes still defiant, searching for hers in the crowd. Then he was gone, swallowed by the brutal machinery of frontier justice, and had vanished as if he'd never been. The promise vanished with him, leaving behind only a hollow echo. Her family, teetering on the edge of ruin, saw their own kind of salvation. Mr. Silas Blackwood, a man more than 30 years her senior, with eyes like chips of flint and a fortune built on land and livestock, had made an offer. It wasn't a proposal of love, but a transaction. Her youth and beauty in exchange for her family's security. Clara, trapped by duty and heartbreak, had walked to the altar like a lamb to the slaughter. Her life with Silas had been one of suffocating quiet. He was not a man of outward warmth. His control was a cold, heavy blanket. His house, though sturdy and filled with possessions she'd never dreamed of, was a prison. His touch was a claim, not a caress. His presence filled every room, a heavy shadow that dictated when she rose, what she wore, and who she was permitted to speak to. He had methodically walled her off from the world, isolating her until her only view was the same dusty horizon she stared at now. His death, a sudden, quiet affair of a heart that finally gave out in his sleep, had not brought her the freedom she might have once craved. It had simply exchanged one prison for another. Now she was the widow Blackwood, a woman of property and propriety, but more alone than ever. The town of Redemption watched her. She felt their stares in the general store, their whispers in the church pews. They were a jury, and she was perpetually on trial. "Doesn't seem to be mourning him much," she heard Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, murmur behind her fan one Sunday. Barely a tear shed at the funeral. A woman that pretty won't stay a widow for long. Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, had said with a knowing chuckle to his friends at the saloon. Blackwood's money must be a comfort, but it won't keep her warm at night. They saw a cold, beautiful woman sitting on a small fortune. They didn't see the girl whose heart had been ripped out a decade ago. They didn't see the wife who had learned to make herself small and silent to survive the chilling dominion of her husband. They didn't see the terror and the loneliness that were her constant bedfellows. They saw only what they wanted to see, a prize to be claimed, a mystery to be solved. Clara lowered her gaze from the horizon to the letter in her hand. This was her secret, her scripture, the one truth she clung to in a world of lies. It was the last letter Eli had managed to get to her, smuggled out by a sympathetic stable boy just before his trial. Her fingers, trembling slightly, traced the faded ink of his scrawl. My dearest Clara, don't you believe a word of it. They're pinning the rustling on me because it's convenient. That deputy wasn't my doing. It's a lie. Clara, you know I ain't no thief, and I ain't no killer. I don't know what will happen, but I need you to know that. Whatever they do to me, whatever they say, the last true thing in my world is you. If I ever get free, I'm coming back. Don't you ever doubt it. Yours always, Eli. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the pocket of her dress, a hidden warmth against her thigh. It was a fragile shield against the town's judgment and her own despair. It was the promise, reaffirmed in ink and desperation. The sun finally dipped below the edge of the world, and the sky deepened to a bruised purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. It was the hour of ghosts, when the day's work was done and the heart was left to reckon with itself. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the wildlife. It was rhythmic, steady, and drawing closer, the unmistakable beat of hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth. Her heart, which had been beating in a slow, tired rhythm, gave a sudden, painful lurch. It was probably just a stray rider, someone from a neighboring ranch cutting across her land. It was nothing. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the wooden porch boards. A shape detached itself from the deepening twilight, a lone rider moving not with haste, but with a weary, deliberate purpose. Her breath caught in her throat. She told herself not to be a fool. Hope was a dangerous, cruel thing in this land. It had burned her once before, and the scars still ached. The rider drew nearer, the silhouette resolving into the shape of a man on a tall, dark horse. He was broad-shouldered but lean, with the familiar slump in the saddle of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on his own 2 feet. He pulled the horse to a stop a dozen yards from the porch, the animal snorting softly in the quiet air. For a long moment, he just sat there, looking at her. She couldn't make out his face, hidden as it was by the brim of a dusty hat and the encroaching darkness. But she felt his gaze, and it was as real and solid as a touch. Every nerve in her body screamed a name she hadn't dared to speak aloud in years. He swung himself down from the saddle. The movement was stiff, as if his bones ached with the memory of 1,000 hard miles. The jingle of his spurs was a sharp, metallic sound in the immense silence. He took off his hat, holding it in his hand, and took a step forward into the last sliver of fading light. The face was thinner than she remembered, etched with lines of hardship that hadn't been there before. A faint, white scar cut through one eyebrow. But the eyes, they were the same impossible blue, and they held a decade of dust and sorrow, of running and fighting and surviving, and they were fixed on her. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that was half sob, half prayer. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the years collapsing into this single, heart-stopping moment. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his boots planted in the red dirt that had tried to swallow him whole. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rougher than she remembered, scraped raw by solitude and disuse. It was the voice of a ghost made flesh. "If you're still waiting," he said, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the time they had lost. He took a breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then I'm still the man who'll marry you." For a long moment, the world held its breath. The words Eli spoke hung in the twilight air, as impossible and as solid as the man himself. Clara stared, her mind a maelstrom of disbelief. This had to be a ghost, a phantom conjured from a decade of lonely sunsets and whispered prayers. The man she had loved was gone, swallowed by rumor and injustice, a memory she kept folded in a worn-out letter. This man standing before her was real. He had weight and substance. He smelled of dust and distance and something fundamentally male and familiar that struck a chord deep within her, a note she thought had gone silent forever. He took another slow step toward the porch, and the movement broke her trance. Her hand, still pressed to her mouth, began to tremble. This was no ghost. Ghosts didn't have weary lines carved around their eyes or a scar that silvered in the dim light. Ghosts didn't make the old porch steps creak with their weight. Eli. He was here. He was alive. The sheer, overwhelming fact of it threatened to buckle her knees. He stopped on the step below her, placing them almost at eye level. His gaze was an inferno of emotions she couldn't begin to name. A deep, aching sorrow. A raw hunger that seemed to see past the black widow's dress to the girl he'd left behind. And a weariness that went bone deep. She saw the cost of his lost years written on his face. He was no longer the laughing, confident boy of her memory. This was a man who had been honed to a sharp, dangerous edge by the world's cruelty. The silence that stretched between them was a chasm filled with 10 years of unspoken words, of separate pains, of lives lived apart. What could they possibly say? How could they bridge such a distance? The air was thick with it, a palpable thing that made it hard to breathe. "Clara," he said again, his voice softer this time, a broken whisper. Just her name. But in it, she heard everything. The long nights spent in hiding, the fear, the unending loneliness, the single burning hope that had kept him alive. She finally lowered her hand, her fingers feeling cold and numb. "Eli," she breathed. And her own voice was foreign, a sound from a life she no longer lived. "They said you were dead, a prison fight years ago." A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "It was easier to be dead. A dead man isn't hunted." He shifted his weight, and she saw him wince, a fleeting shadow of pain crossing his features. Can we sit for a spell? The ride was long." Nodding dumbly, she stepped back, her legs moving with a strange, disconnected feeling. She sank onto the top step of the porch, the rough wood a familiar anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted. Eli eased himself down beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body through the cool night air. He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a man setting down a burden he'd carried for a lifetime. They sat there as the last vestiges of color drained from the sky, leaving a deep, star-dusted indigo in its wake. The wind whispered through the dry grass, and the crickets began their nightly chorus. It was a symphony of loneliness she knew by heart, but tonight it sounded different, less empty. "You married," he stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact he was coming to terms with. His gaze was fixed on the horizon. "I had to," she replied, her voice barely audible. "My family." She didn't need to finish. In this unforgiving land, survival often demanded unthinkable sacrifices. "Blackwood," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "I heard he was a hard man." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill running through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He was a provider." It was the most neutral, the most honest thing she could say. She would not speak ill of the dead, nor would she lie to the living ghost beside her. He gave a slow nod, understanding all the things she left unsaid. For a while, that was all. They were two strangers, sharing a porch, bound by a past that was too immense to speak of and a present that was too fragile to touch. The awkwardness was a living thing between them. He fiddled with the brim of his hat, now resting on his knee. She smoothed the fabric of her dress over and over, her fingers tracing invisible patterns. Finally, he broke the silence again. "After I got away," he began, his voice low and raspy. "I couldn't stay in Texas. Couldn't stay anywhere for long. They put a price on my head. Said I was a traitor for what happened with that deputy, that I'd been working with bandits from across the border." He shook his head, the movement full of a weary disgust. "It was all lies. Clara, a setup from the start. But a lie travels faster than the truth, and it sticks harder." He spoke of a life lived in the shadows, of sleeping in caves and abandoned line shacks, of never staying in one town more than a night, of always looking over his shoulder. He spoke of taking different names, of working odd jobs on remote ranches where men didn't ask questions, of becoming a ghost long before the world had declared him dead. He didn't speak of violence or bloodshed, but she could hear it in the spaces between his words, the constant threat, the nearness of death, the brutal necessity of survival. He had been hunted like an animal for a decade, all for a crime he didn't commit. As he spoke, she began to see the man beside her more clearly. The guarded look in his eyes was the watchfulness of a man who expects danger from every direction. The tension in his shoulders was from years of sleeping with one eye open. The deep lines on his face were a map of his hardship. And yet, underneath it all, a fire still burned. She could feel it, a stubborn, resilient core that had refused to be extinguished. The embers of the boy she knew were still glowing in the heart of this hardened stranger. When his voice trailed off, the silence that followed was different. The chasm was still there, but a fragile bridge was being built across it, woven from the threads of his quiet confession. He turned his head and finally looked at her fully. In that moment, under the vast, uncaring blanket of the night sky, they truly saw each other. Clara saw the raw pain in his eyes, the deep loneliness that mirrored her own. But she also saw the unwavering strength that had carried him through an impossible ordeal and had, somehow, led him back here, to her porch. She saw the longing there, a desperate, thirsty craving for something real and true, in a life that had been built on lies and running. It was a look that stripped away the years, that saw past the widow's weeds and the carefully constructed walls around her heart. It was a look that remembered the girl who had believed in his promise. Eli looked at Clara and saw more than just the somber widow the town knew. He saw the ghost of the vibrant, laughing girl he had carried in his memory through every cold night and every desperate day. He saw the toll the years had taken, the sadness that clung to her like a second skin, the guarded set of her mouth, but he also saw the same fierce spirit in the depths of her dark eyes, the same loyalty that had made him believe, even in his darkest moments, that he had something to survive for. He saw his anchor, his home. The air grew thick, charged with a current of unspoken emotion that crackled between them. It was a dangerous, powerful thing, this sudden rekindling. It felt like a fire being lit in a dry tinder barn. It could either bring warmth or it could burn everything to the ground. Her heart, a slow and sluggish muscle for so long, began to beat a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her lips parted, and a question she hadn't even known she was forming escaped in a shaky whisper. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "After all this time, after everything, why have you come back now?" Eli's gaze intensified, his blue eyes seeming to burn in the darkness. He held her stare, and in that look, he poured all the conviction and certainty that had been his only true possessions for 10 years. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a low, raw murmur that went straight through her. "No matter how many times I nearly died, no matter how close I came to giving up and letting the shadows take me, I could never forget you were waiting here." The simple, profound truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had not forgotten. He had held on to her, to the memory of her, as his only reason. All her lonely years of waiting, all the silent prayers into her pillow, the secret hope she had nurtured against all logic. It had not been in vain. He had been holding on, too. The dam she had so carefully constructed around her heart, the one that had held back a decade of grief, fear, and aching loneliness, finally broke. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. Then another followed. She didn't make a sound, didn't sob or gasp. The tears just fell, a silent, streaming release for a pain too deep for words. They were tears for the boy who was lost, for the man who had returned, for the years they could never get back, and for the terrifying, beautiful, impossible hope that was blooming in the wreckage of her heart. Their eyes remained locked, and in the starlight, he watched her cry. The raw emotion of the reunion left them adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The night was deep and quiet now. The tears on Clara's face had dried, leaving behind cool tracks on her skin. The question of what now hung between them, as vast and intimidating as the darkened plains. It was Eli who finally gave it voice, his tone practical, yet gentle. "I can't stay in the house," he said, his eyes finding hers in the gloom. "A man like me, showing up on a widow's doorstep, it'll bring you nothing but trouble. The kind of trouble you don't need." Clara knew he was right. Her life was already a fishbowl, her every move scrutinized by the prying eyes of redemption. To have a man, a wanted man, a ghost from her past, staying under her roof would be a scandal she couldn't survive. It would confirm every vicious whisper they already leveled at her. "The barn," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "It's dry. There's clean hay. I can bring you blankets." He nodded, a look of profound gratitude softening the hard lines of his face. "The barn is a palace compared to some places I've laid my head. Thank you, Clara." That night, Clara lay in her large, empty bed, the same bed she had shared with Silas Blackwood. For the first time in years, the silence of the house was not just empty, but filled with a potent, humming awareness. He was just 100 feet away. A wall of wood and a stretch of dusty earth separated them, but she could feel his presence as if it were a physical weight, a magnetic pull on her soul. Sleep was a long time coming. The next morning, the town of Redemption awoke to a new curiosity, as Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, was drawing water from her well. She saw him, a tall, broad-shouldered stranger, mending a section of the widow Blackwood's fence that had been sagging for months. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that spoke of a life of hard work. She squinted, her lips pursing into a thin line of disapproval and intrigue. By noon, the news was all over town. "Saw a hired man out at the Blackwood place," one rancher commented to another at the general store. "Strange she didn't mention needing help." "He's no hired man I've ever seen," another countered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the spittoon. "Keeps to himself, works hard, though already got that whole north fence line straightened." The whispers followed Clara when she went to the market for supplies. The usual polite, if cool. Nods were replaced with lingering stares. The women gathered in tighter circles, their voices dropping to hushed tones as she passed. She felt their judgment like a physical force, a heavy cloak of suspicion. She kept her chin high, her face a mask of serene composure. But inside, a familiar knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Eli, for his part, seemed oblivious to the town's growing fixation, or, more likely, he was simply used to being an outsider, an object of suspicion. He did not speak unless spoken to, and he kept his head down, his focus entirely on the work. But his presence began to transform the small, neglected farm. He repaired the loose shutter that had banged against the house in the wind for a year. He cleared the stubborn, thorny weeds that were choking the life out of her small vegetable garden. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the kitchen door. Each act was a quiet testament, a gentle rebuilding of her world. Clara would watch him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough, her hands pausing in their work. The sight of him, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his back strong and tanned under the relentless sun, was a ghost come to life. The rhythmic thud of his hammer, the steady scrape of his hoe in the dirt. These were the sounds of a life she had once dreamed of. Each motion was a familiar echo of the boy he had been, now performed by a man who was a stranger, yet more known to her than anyone on earth. It was a slow, agonizingly sweet torture. Days bled into a week. They lived in a state of careful distance. She would leave a plate of food for him on a stump near the barn. He would leave a bucket of fresh water from the well on her back porch. Their conversations were brief, stilted exchanges about the weather or the work that needed doing, but the space between them was charged with everything they couldn't say. Every time their eyes met, a current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the fire that smoldered just beneath the surface of their polite arrangement. One evening, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy and still, thick with the metallic scent of impending rain. A storm was rolling in from the north, a great dark beast of a thing that promised to break the back of the late summer heat. Clara stood on the porch, watching the clouds gather, and thought of Eli in the barn. She'd given him a couple of old horse blankets, but they were thin. The nights were growing cooler, and a storm like this would bring a deep, penetrating chill. Acting on an impulse she didn't try to analyze, she went inside and pulled a thick woolen quilt from the chest at the foot of her bed. It was one of the few things of beauty and comfort she owned that hadn't come from Silas, carrying it in her arms. She hurried across the yard as the first fat drops of rain began to spatter in the dust around her feet. She reached the barn just as the heavens opened. The rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the world outside into a roaring, gray blur. She pushed the heavy barn door open and slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her. The air inside was cool and close, thick with the scent of hay, leather, and dry earth. A single lantern cast a pool of warm, flickering light in the center of the vast, shadowy space. Eli was sitting on an overturned bucket, mending a piece of harness, his head bent in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper. "Clara," he said, rising to his feet, "you shouldn't be out in this." "I brought you this," she said, her voice sounding small against the drumming of the rain on the roof. She held out the quilt. "I thought it will be cold tonight." He took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of heat straight up her arm. For a moment, neither of them moved, the quilt a bridge between them. The roar of the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the thundering of her own heart. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I know." The wind howled, rattling the barn doors in their frame. A draft snaked through a gap in the planks, carrying the damp chill of the storm with it. Clara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "You're cold," Eli observed, "and wet. Come sit by the lantern." He led her to a pile of clean hay near the light, spreading one of the older horse blankets over it. They sat down, the space between them seeming both impossibly vast and terrifyingly small. The rain hammered down, a relentless rhythm that cocooned them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. In the dim, golden light, surrounded by the storm's fury, it felt as if they were the only two people left alive. They sat in silence, listening to the rain. Clara could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, could feel the slight tremor in her own hands. She was intensely aware of his breathing, the soft rise and fall of his chest. The air was heavy with unspoken words, with a decade of repressed longing. The dampness seemed to seep into everything, making the air thick and intimate. Instinctively, to ward off another shiver, she drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. A stray drop of water from a leak in the roof fell, landing on the back of her hand. Before she could wipe it away, Eli's hand covered hers. His hand was warm, calloused, and strong. It was not a gesture of passion, but of simple, profound comfort. But it was enough. The gentle pressure of his fingers sent a wave of heat through her entire body. She looked up at him, and her breath caught in her throat. His face was inches from hers, his blue eyes dark with an emotion so intense it was almost painful to see. Slowly, as if in a dream, he raised his other hand and gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, hesitant, but it burned her skin. He let his fingers trail down the line of her jaw, a silent question in their touch. The world narrowed to the space of a single breath. All the fear, all the town's gossip, all the lonely years faded away, leaving only this moment, this man, and the undeniable truth of her own heart. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. This was it. This was the moment she had both craved and dreaded. One more inch, one slight movement, and the dam would break completely. And that terrified her. A jolt of panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. The face of Silas Blackwood flashed in her mind, his cold eyes, his proprietary touch. The whispers of the townspeople echoed in her ears. The pretty widow won't stay alone for long. Was this what she was? A weak woman, falling into the arms of the first man who showed her a sliver of kindness. She pulled back, breaking the contact. The movement was sudden, almost violent. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. I should go, she stammered, not looking at him. The storm might be letting up. It was a lie. The rain was coming down harder than ever. Eli remained seated, his hand falling back to his side. He didn't try to stop her. He just watched her, his face a mask of sorrowful understanding. The fire in his eyes had been banked, replaced by a familiar, weary sadness. Clara's hand was on the latch of the door, her emotions a chaotic, tangled mess. She felt shame for her weakness, fear for her future, and a deep, aching regret for the moment she had just thrown away. She was at war with herself, not knowing whether to trust the man before her or fear the feelings he ignited in her. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the din of the storm. She paused, her back still to him. "I'm not here to claim you," he said softly. The words were a balm on her raw, conflicted soul. "I'm just here to be near you, that's all." Eli's words in the storm-lashed barn became both a comfort and a torment to Clara in the days that followed. "I'm not here to claim you, just to be near you." The gentleness of the sentiment was a stark contrast to the life she had known with Silas, a life of ownership and obligation. Eli was offering her something she hadn't realized she was starving for, a presence without possession. At night, she would lie awake and replay the memory of his hand covering hers, the warmth of it, the hesitant question in his touch. Her heart, a long dormant thing, ached with a feeling so potent it was almost painful. It was a fierce, protective love, a dangerous and exhilarating bloom in the barren landscape of her existence. But her heart was at war with her mind. Her mind was a fortress, built brick by brick from a decade of survival. It knew the rules of this world. It understood the cold calculus of reputation and ruin. It heard the whispers in town, which had grown from a low murmur to a persistent, buzzing hum of speculation. It saw the hard stares and the way women would pull their children a little closer when she passed. Her mind told her that harboring Eli was an act of madness, a gamble with the only thing she had left, the fragile peace of her solitude and the security of her land. The love in her heart was a tender green shoot, but the fear in her mind was a wall of stone, seeking solace, or perhaps clarity. She did what the women of redemption were taught to do when their souls were troubled. She went to church. She dressed in her customary black, her face veiled, and knelt in the cool, silent sanctuary. The air smelled of old wood and beeswax, a scent that was supposed to bring peace but only seemed to amplify her turmoil. She prayed, not with words, but with the full, desperate weight of her conflicted heart. After the sparse congregation had dispersed, Reverend Miller found her still kneeling in the pew. He was a tall, thin man with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of mild disappointment with the world and its sinners. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and pious, "it is good to see you seeking the Lord's counsel." Clara rose, her hands clasped before her. "Reverend, my heart is heavy." "I have noticed a shadow upon you," he said, his eyes small and shrewd, missing nothing. "The town has noticed, as well. They speak of the man working your land."
"He is an old acquaintance,"
Clara said, her voice tight. He was in need of work. The Reverend gave a slow, paternal nod. "Charity is a virtue, my child, but wisdom must be its guide. I have heard whispers that this is the same man who brought shame upon his name 10 years ago. Eli." He said the name as if it were a contagion. "The Lord teaches forgiveness, it is true, but he also warns us not to yoke ourselves to the unrighteous. That man is an outcast. Clara, he carries the stain of disgrace. To tie your fate to his is to invite his ruin upon your own house. Do not be foolish enough to love a man whom God and society have abandoned." His words, meant as counsel, felt like stones being hurled at her. There was no comfort here, no divine guidance, only the town's judgment, dressed up in scripture. She had come seeking refuge and had found only a confirmation of her deepest fears. She left the church feeling more isolated than ever, the stone wall in her mind growing taller and thicker. The external threat was not long in coming. 2 days later, a buggy pulled up to her farmhouse. It was Jebediah Thorne, her late husband's brother-in-law. He was a portly, florid man with Silas's cold eyes, but none of his quiet authority. Jebediah was a man who enjoyed the power that came with the Blackwood name, and he looked at Clara not as a grieving relative, but as a troublesome asset he had to manage. He didn't wait for an invitation, striding onto her porch as if he owned it. "Clara," he said, foregoing any pleasantries, "we need to talk." Eli was on the far side of the property, out of sight, but Clara's heart leaped into her throat.
"Jebediah, this is unexpected."
"I'll be direct," he said, his eyes scanning her property with a sneer. "The family is concerned. We hear you've taken in a stray, a dangerous one, at that, a wanted man."
"He is a hired hand,"
Clara insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Jebediah laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Don't play me for a fool. I know exactly who he is, and I'm here to tell you, on behalf of the Blackwood estate, that it stops. Now?" He took a step closer, his bulk crowding her. "Your late husband was a pillar of this community. We will not have his name, or his widow, associated with a common criminal. This land, this house, it was all paid for by his good name. If you continue to harbor that fugitive, you will find that the family's goodwill and your claim to this property can evaporate mighty quickly. Get rid of him, or we will, and we'll take the land back while we're at it." The threat was naked, brutal, and utterly real. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. He wasn't just talking about her reputation anymore. He was talking about her home, her survival. She was a woman alone, in a dispute over property. She stood no chance against the Blackwood family's money and influence. From that moment on, a chilling caution governed her every move. She loved Eli, but she was terrified. The fear was a physical presence, a cold hand gripping her heart. She began to avoid him. She left his meals on the porch and was gone before he came for them. When he tried to speak to her, she would offer a curt, distracted reply and hurry back inside. She stopped watching him from the window. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, on her chores, on anything but the man in her barn. She was trying to protect him, trying to protect herself. But in doing so, she was building a new wall between them, one made of fear and silence. Eli felt the change immediately. The warmth that had begun to grow between them vanished, replaced by an inexplicable frost. He saw the furtive way she moved, the way she flinched when he spoke. He saw the fresh wave of whispers that followed her in town, the increased intensity of the stares, and he misinterpreted it all. He had lived for a decade as a pariah, a man whose very presence brought trouble. He knew the signs. He saw her avoidance not as fear for him, but as shame of him. He believed that the reality of his tarnished name had finally sunk in, that she was recoiling from the disgrace he represented. The misunderstanding festered for 3 days, a poison in the air between them. Finally, he could bear it no more. He found her by the well as dusk was settling, her back to him. "Clara," he said. She started, turning around with a guarded, fearful look in her eyes that cut him to the quick. "We can't go on like this," he said, his voice strained. "You hiding in the house, me skulking in the barn. It ain't right."
I don't know what you're talking about,
she said, her voice weak. "Don't you?" he shot back, his hurt making him sharper than he intended. "You won't even look at me. Am I that repulsive to you now that you've had a taste of what it's like to have my shadow on your doorstep?" "No, Eli, it's not that. It's complicated." "Complicated?" He let out a harsh laugh. "What's complicated is me thinking for one damn minute that I could come back here and not destroy you. I see the way they look at you in town. I see the fear in your eyes. You're ashamed of me, and you have every right to be." "That's not true," she cried, tears welling. "Isn't it?" he pressed, his own pain blinding him. "I'm a ghost, Clara, a wanted man with a traitor's brand. I hoped it wouldn't matter to you, but I was a fool. I can't give you anything but trouble and disgrace. Jebediah Thorne was here, wasn't he? I saw his buggy. He threatened you." She couldn't answer, her silence a confirmation that ripped his heart out. He took a step back, a terrible finality settling over him. "I won't do it. I won't be the reason you lose everything. I survived 10 years in hell dreaming of you. I won't be the one who drags you down into it." He turned and strode toward the barn. "I'm leaving. Tonight." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Leaving? He was leaving. The walls of her carefully constructed prison of fear crumbled in an instant, revealing the one, simple, unbearable truth. A life of safety without him was no life at all. As he disappeared into the barn, the sky, which had been threatening all afternoon, finally broke. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, turning the dusty yard into a slick of mud. She could hear him inside, the sounds of him gathering his meager belongings, the nicker of his horse. He was really doing it. Panic, pure and primal, seized her. She ran, heedless of the rain that soaked her dress and plastered her hair to her face, heedless of the mud that sucked at her shoes. She ran to the barn. She burst through the door to see him tightening the cinch on his saddle. He didn't look at her. "Go back to the house, Clara," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "It's better this way." "No," she choked out. He swung up into the saddle, a grim silhouette ready to ride back into the shadows. He urged the horse toward the open door, toward the oblivion that had been his home for a decade. She lunged forward, grabbing his arm with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The horse shied, but she held on, her fingers digging into the wet fabric of his sleeve. He looked down at her, his face a mask of anguish in the dim light. "Please," she begged, the rain and her tears mingling on her cheeks. "Don't go." "I have to," he rasped, "to protect you." "You'll kill me if you do," she sobbed, the words tearing from the deepest part of her soul. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, holding his. "If you leave," she said, her voice a trembling, desperate whisper. "My heart leaves this place with you." Her words, a raw and desperate confession in the pouring rain, changed everything. Eli slid down from his saddle, his boots landing with a soft thud in the mud. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly as the storm raged around them. He was not leaving, not now, not ever again. From that night, a new, fragile reality took shape. Eli moved from the barn into a small, sparse room at the back of the house, a room meant for a hired hand. And that was the fiction they presented to the world, to anyone who asked. Eli was simply a drifter she had hired to help with the heavy work on the farm. It was a flimsy shield, a story so thin it was almost transparent, but it was the only one they had. Inside the walls of the small farmhouse, however, a quiet intimacy began to bloom. They fell into a rhythm that was both new and anciently familiar. They ate their meals together at the small kitchen table, the silence between them no longer awkward but filled with a comfortable, humming awareness. Clara found herself watching the way the morning light caught the silver in his hair, the way his hands, though calloused and scarred, were gentle as he handled a cup. He, in turn, would watch her as she moved about the kitchen, a small, secret smile touching his lips when she wasn't looking. It was a delicate dance of stolen glances and unspoken affections, a life lived in the quiet spaces, away from the prying eyes of the world. But the world would not be kept at bay. Their charade fooled no one. The town of redemption, having passed its initial judgment, now settled into a state of cold, righteous condemnation. Clara bore the brunt of it. When she went to the general store, conversations would cease the moment she stepped through the door. Mrs. Henderson, who had once traded recipes with her, now turned her back, busying herself with a bolt of calico. Men who had once tipped their hats in respect now stared through her as if she were a ghost. The shunning was a silent, suffocating thing, a collective turning of the back that was more chilling than any spoken insult. The worst was on Sunday. She walked into church, her head held high, and a wave of silence rippled through the pews. The spot where she always sat was empty, but the families on either side seemed to shrink away, creating a visible, unbreachable gap around her. Reverend Miller's sermon was on the sins of the flesh and the company of the wicked, his gaze seeming to find hers with every pointed verse. She endured it, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but each word was a small, sharp stone cast in her direction. She was no longer just the widow Blackwood. She was the woman who lived with a sinner, an outcast, and in their eyes, his stain had become her own. She would return from these excursions to the quiet sanctuary of the farm, her composure a brittle shell around a churning sea of doubt. She would see Eli, his presence so solid and real, and the love she felt for him would surge, a fierce and undeniable tide. But later, alone in her room, the town's verdict would creep back in. She would look at her reflection in the small, warped mirror and see not a woman in love, but a fool. Was this love worth it? Was it worth the loss of her community, her reputation, the last vestiges of the respectable life Silas had given her? She had been so alone for so long, and now, in finding Eli, she had found a new, more profound kind of isolation. She was losing everything she had for a ghost, for a man with no name and no future. The doubts began to eat at her, a corrosive acid that threatened to dissolve the very foundations of her resolve. Was their love strong enough to be a world unto itself, or would it collapse under the weight of the one they had been cast out of? Eli was not blind. He saw the toll the town's shunning was taking on her. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way her smile, when it came, never quite reached them. He saw her return from town, her face pale and strained, and a slow, helpless anger burned in his gut. He knew he was the cause of her pain, and the guilt was a heavier burden than any he had carried during his years on the run. One evening, after she had returned from a particularly brutal trip to the market, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, her purchases still in the basket by her feet. He knew that look. It was the look of a person nearing their breaking point. He said nothing at first. He simply lit the lantern on the table, the warm, golden light pushing back the encroaching shadows. Then he went to his room and returned with his saddlebag. It was old and scuffed, the leather worn smooth with age and travel. He placed it on the table in front of her. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice soft. He unbuckled the straps and reached inside, pulling out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle tied with a piece of twine. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing a thick stack of letters, their edges frayed, the paper yellowed and creased. They were not in envelopes. They were just folded sheets of paper, written on with whatever ink or pencil he had been able to find. "I couldn't send them," he said, his gaze fixed on the letters. "There was never anywhere to send them to, and it was too dangerous. But I wrote them anyway." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, vulnerable plea. "I wrote them for 5 years, until I heard you'd married. I stopped then." Clara stared at the stack of letters, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. She reached out a trembling hand and picked up the one on top. The date was scrawled in the corner, less than a year after he had disappeared. His familiar handwriting, though rougher, was a jolt to her system. She began to read. It was not a letter filled with hope. It was a desperate, angry scrawl from a man in a Mexican jail. Wrongly accused of horse theft, he wrote of the filth and the despair. But mostly, he wrote of her face, the only clear image in the nightmare of his life. The next letter was from a mining camp in the mountains, his hands raw from the work, his spirit raw from the loneliness. He wrote about dreaming of her laughter. Another was from a dusty cow town on the border, where he'd seen a woman with hair the same color as hers, and it had nearly broken him. She read on, letter after letter. They were a map of his lost years, a chronicle of his pain and survival. He wrote of near misses with the law, of cold nights spent sleeping under the stars with an empty belly, of the crushing weight of his false name, and through it all, woven into every line, was her. She was his compass, his North Star, the reason he put one foot in front of the other each day. He wrote to her as if she were there, telling her about his day, asking her questions he knew she could never answer, ending each letter the same way. "I'm still coming back for you. Clarabelle, don't you ever doubt it." Tears began to stream down her face, silent and unchecked. This was not the confession of a hardened criminal. This was the testament of a man who had endured the unendurable, fueled by a love that had refused to die. All her doubts, all the town's whispers and accusations, all the fear that had been poisoning her, it all washed away in the flood of her tears. The love she had questioned was not a fragile thing. It was the strongest thing in the world. It had kept this man alive. She was so lost in the letters. She didn't realize he had moved until she felt his presence behind her. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, his thumbs stroking the tense muscles there. She leaned back against him, the letters clutched to her chest, and sobbed. For him, for her, for all the years they had lost. He bent his head, resting his cheek against her hair, and held her, not trying to stop the tears, just anchoring her in her storm of emotion. When her sobs finally subsided, a profound quiet settled over the room. It was in that quiet that Clara knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, what she had to do. The time for fear and hesitation was over. Slowly, she turned on the chair, her knees brushing against his. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. She raised a hand to his face, her fingers tracing the scar over his eyebrow, the hard line of his jaw. This was her man, her Eli. He had come back from the dead for her. She would not let the ghosts of her past or the judgment of others stand between them any longer. Leaning forward, she closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, tentative kiss at first. A question. He was still for a moment, as if in shock, and then he responded, his lips gentle against hers, a silent answer. The kiss deepened, and it was no longer tentative. It was a release, a floodgate opening on a decade of pent-up longing. She rose, taking his hand and leading him from the kitchen, through the dark house, and into her room. in the soft light from the open doorway. She turned to face him. This was her room, her bed, the space where she had lived as the widow Blackwood. Tonight, she would reclaim it. She would reclaim herself. With deliberate, steady hands, she began to unbutton the high collar of her black dress. It was a shedding of a skin, a casting off of the grief and the duty and the loneliness that had defined her for so long. Eli watched her, his face a canvas of awe and a deep, reverent love. When her hands fumbled, he reached out and helped her, his touch sure and gentle. He peeled back the layers of her sorrow until she stood before him, not as a widow in mourning, but simply as Clara. He touched the scars on her heart with his gaze, and she touched the scars on his body with her hands. It was a slow, sacred exploration, a relearning of each other in a silent language of touch and breath. When they finally came together, it was not a moment of wild passion, but of profound homecoming. It was the end of a long, impossible journey. It was two halves of a single soul, torn apart by a cruel world, finally finding their way back to each other. It was quiet, and it was perfect. Afterward, they lay in the silence, wrapped in each other's arms, the sound of their breathing the only noise in the sleeping house. Clara felt a peace so deep it was as if she had never known anything but turmoil before. She was no longer alone. Eli shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his eyes shining in the dim light. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough whisper, filled with a decade of unshed emotion and the certainty of a vow being made. "From this night on," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "you are my bride, forever." Their fragile peace, lived in the quiet moments between chores and stolen glances, was never destined to last. The world they had shut out was patient, and its memory was long. The news of Eli's survival, which had begun as a salacious whisper among the townsfolk, had finally traveled on the telegraph wires, a spark of information that landed on the desk of Sheriff Brody in the county seat. 50 miles away, a 10-year-old warrant for a traitor and murderer was pulled from a dusty file, and with it, the long arm of the law began its slow, inexorable reach toward redemption. The warning came not as an official notice, but in the dead of night, delivered by a trembling stable boy who sometimes did odd jobs for Clara. He'd overheard men talking at the saloon, a deputy from the county seat boasting that they'd be riding out in a day or two to collect the bounty on Eli's head. "They're forming a posse, Mrs. Blackwood," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with fear in the moonlight. "They're coming for him." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. For a moment, she was paralyzed. The image of Eli in shackles, bruised and defiant, flashing in her mind. But the paralysis was fleeting, replaced by a fierce, desperate resolve. She would not let them take him. Not again. The next morning, she rode into town, her face a pale, determined mask. Her first stop was the office of Mayor Thompson, a man whose primary concern was the smooth, uninterrupted flow of commerce. He listened to her plea with a pursed-lipped expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Clara," he said, his tone oozing a placating but firm dismissal. "My hands are tied. This is a county matter. Sheriff Brody has a warrant. It is the law. To interfere would be to obstruct justice. Besides," he added, his gaze flicking away, "harboring a known fugitive, it reflects poorly on our town. It suggests we are a place where lawlessness is tolerated." "He is innocent," Clara insisted, her voice ringing with a conviction that was met with a blank, political stare. "That is for a judge to decide," the mayor said smoothly, rising from his desk. "And I suggest you give him up peacefully. It will be better for everyone." Her hope curdling into a cold fury. She went to the church. She found Reverend Miller tending his roses, his back to her. He did not turn as she approached, her boots crunching on the gravel path.
"Reverend, I need your help,"
she began, her voice tight. "They are coming to arrest Eli. You are a man of God. You can speak to the town, appeal for mercy, for a fair hearing." He snipped a dead blossom from a rosebush before he finally turned, his face a mask of pious sorrow. "My child, I warned you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You chose to lie down with a sinner, and now you must reap the consequences. The law of man is a reflection of the law of God. This man is a fugitive. You ask me to stand with a criminal against the forces of order? You ask me to condone your sin? I will pray for your soul, Clara, but I will not aid in your folly." He turned his back on her, returning to his roses. He had excommunicated her not with a decree, but with a simple, devastating gesture. She was utterly alone. As she rode out of town, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers were gone, replaced by open hostility. A group of men, Jebediah Thorne among them, stood outside the saloon, their faces hard and accusing. Someone shouted, "Traitor's whore!" The word struck her, but she did not flinch. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, but inside, she felt the last bridge to the world she had known burn to ashes. The town was no longer just shunning her. They were blaming her. She was the vessel of their fear, the source of the trouble that was coming to their quiet, orderly lives. When she reached the farm, she slid from her horse and ran into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. Eli met her in the kitchen, taking one look at her face and knowing. "They're coming," he said, his voice a low, grim statement. "Tonight or tomorrow," she confirmed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Eli, no one will help us. The whole town, they want you gone. They want us gone." He looked around the small, simple kitchen, the first real home he had known in a decade. A look of profound weariness settled on his face. "I knew this day would come," he said softly. "I'll ride out, lead them away from you." "No," she said, her voice suddenly fierce. She grabbed the front of his shirt, her knuckles white. "No more running alone. You lived like that for 10 years for me. Now I'll live like that with you. We'll go together. We'll run." The idea was madness. A life on the run, in the wilderness, with winter approaching. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw not fear, but an unshakable, defiant love. She had made her choice. Her world was no longer redemption. It was him. They fled that night, with only the sliver of a new moon to light their way. They packed what they could carry, a little food, blankets, a rifle, and Eli's stack of letters. As they rode away from the small farmhouse, Clara did not look back. She was leaving a prison, not a home. They cut north into the rocky, unforgiving hill country, avoiding the roads, following game trails through the dense scrub oak and mesquite. On the second night, as they were making a difficult crossing over a steep, scree-covered ridge, their luck nearly ran out. The sound of hoofbeats and the distant flicker of lanterns from a patrol below sent them scrambling for cover behind a cluster of boulders. They held their breath, pressed against the cold stone, as the posse passed just 100 yards beneath them, the men's voices carrying on the still night air. In the frantic rush for cover, Clara's foot slipped on the loose rock, and she went down hard. She stifled a cry of pain as a sharp stone sliced open her calf. Once the posse was gone, Eli helped her up, his face etched with worry in the moonlight. "You're hurt," he whispered, tearing a strip from his own shirt to bandage the wound. It was not a deep cut, but it was a stark, bloody reminder of the life she had chosen. This was the price of their freedom. For a week, they traveled deeper into the wilderness, into a land that was not on any map. Eli, drawing on his 10 years of survival, led them to a place he had stumbled upon long ago, a small, abandoned trapper's cabin, nestled in a hidden valley beside a clear, fast-running stream. It was dilapidated, the roof sagging and the door hanging by one hinge, but it was sheltered, secluded, and safe. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, they found a brief, stolen happiness. They worked together to make the cabin habitable, chinking the logs with mud and moss, repairing the roof with pine boughs. Their days were filled with the simple, elemental tasks of survival. Eli would hunt and fish, Clara would tend the fire, forage for edible roots and berries, and mend their worn clothes. They lived as husband and wife. Their world shrunk to the small cabin, the whispering pines, and the murmuring stream. The fear and judgment of redemption felt a world away. Here, there was no past, no future, only the profound, peaceful present of being together. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and he would hold her, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt completely and utterly free. But the fear, though buried, was not gone. It lived in the shadows of her heart, a dormant beast. One night, Eli was awakened by a sound. He turned to see Clara, asleep beside him, tossing in the grip of a nightmare. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed with anguish. A single tear tracked a path through the grime on her cheek. "No," she whimpered, her voice a choked, sleeping whisper. "Don't take him. Please, don't take him." He reached out to touch her shoulder, to wake her from the dream, but froze as she spoke again. Her words a desperate, heartbreaking plea into the darkness. "I would rather die with you," she sobbed in her sleep. The words pierced Eli's heart. He looked at her, so fierce and strong in her waking hours, now so vulnerable, tormented by a terror she would never admit to him. He gently wiped the tear from her cheek, his hand trembling slightly. He had been content in their small, hidden paradise. He had been willing to live out his days as a ghost, as long as he could be with her. But her words, dredged up from the deepest part of her soul, showed him the truth. This was no life for her. This happiness was a fragile illusion, built on a foundation of his running and her fear. He could not protect her from the nightmares. He could not give her a real life, a real future. As long as he was a wanted man, they could not outrun his past forever. He rose from their makeshift bed and went to the cabin door, staring out at the moonlit valley. He had spent 10 years running for himself. Now, looking at the sleeping woman who would rather die than lose him again, he knew, with a chilling, absolute certainty, that the time for running was over. The time for fighting had begun. He had to go back. Not to run, but to reclaim his name. For her. The morning after her nightmare, the idyllic peace of their hidden valley felt like a lie. Clara awoke to find Eli already awake, staring into the embers of the fire, a new and unsettling stillness about him. The hunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by something harder, more resolute. "I heard you last night," he said, his voice quiet. "In your sleep." Clara felt a flush of shame, but he reached across and took her hand. "This is no life for you, Clara. Hiding in the woods, starting at every shadow, haunted by nightmares. Happiness shouldn't have to be a secret. We can't run forever." "Then what do we do?" she whispered, dread coiling in her stomach. "They will never stop looking." "Then I'll stop running," he declared. "I'm going to turn myself in." The words were a physical shock. "No, Eli, they'll hang you. It'll be a farce, just like before." "Not in redemption," he said, his grip on her hand tightening. "Not in that county. I'll ride to the state capitol. I'll turn myself in to a U.S. Marshal, not some local sheriff. I'll demand a new trial, a state trial, where the Blackwood name and old grudges don't run the show. It's the only way. I have to face them, not just for me, but for you. I want to give you a life, not a hideout." His logic was terrifying, but inescapable. Their stolen happiness was a gilded cage, and the fear would always be the bars. Her nightmares were proof of that. Her love for him was stronger than her fear for herself. She looked into his determined eyes and saw not a man surrendering, but a man fighting for their future. "All right," she said. her own resolve hardening. "Then we do it together." They were a team. Eli planned the approach, while Clara, with her more refined hand, spent 2 days drafting a long, detailed letter to the circuit judge. She wrote not as a lover, but as a witness. She laid out the entire conspiracy as she understood it. The corrupt Deputy Finch, who had a known history of violence, the powerful ranchers who had stood to gain from Eli's removal, and the suspicious speed of his original conviction. She poured every ounce of her intelligence and conviction onto the pages. It was a plea not for mercy, but for justice. Leaving their sanctuary was the hardest thing they had ever done. 2 weeks later, Eli, with Clara's letter in his pocket, rode into the state capitol and surrendered himself. He was immediately imprisoned, the old charges reinstated. But Clara's letter had an effect. Intrigued by the allegations from the widow of a prominent man like Silas Blackwood, the circuit judge granted Eli's petition for a new trial. The trial was a spectacle. The whole town of Redemption, it seemed, had descended upon the Capitol, filling the gallery of the imposing brick courthouse. On one side sat Jebediah Thorne and his allies, their faces set in smug, confident sneers. On the other sat a smaller, more curious contingent, the women who had once shunned Clara now watching with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The prosecution presented its case with brutal efficiency. They recounted the story of a cattle rustler and a murdered lawman, painting Eli as a violent drifter. The old evidence, flimsy as it was presented as incontrovertible fact. For days, it seemed as if history was doomed to repeat itself, that the gears of a corrupt system would grind Eli down once more. The turning point came from an unexpected source: Eli's court-appointed lawyer. A young, earnest man who had initially believed his client guilty called a surprise witness, an old, grizzled ranch hand named Bartholomew Hemlock. Hemlock, now frail and consumed by a decade of guilt, had worked for one of the ranchers who had accused Eli. With a trembling voice, he confessed the truth. Deputy Finch had been the one running the rustling ring. He had been skimming cattle from his own employers, when Eli, then just a young cowboy on the drive, had stumbled upon the truth. Finch had framed him for the whole operation, shooting his own partner in the ensuing chaos and blaming it on Eli. "Finch told us to keep our mouths shut," Hemlock rasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Said he'd see us all hanged if we didn't play along. We were cowards. We let an innocent boy take the fall." A shockwave went through the courtroom, but it was still one man's word against a dead lawman's reputation. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle was Clara. When she was called to the stand, a hush fell over the gallery. Dressed in a simple gray dress, no longer the widow in black, she looked composed but fragile. The prosecutor questioned her with barely concealed contempt, trying to portray her as a foolish, love-sick woman, easily manipulated by a killer. But when her own lawyer began his questions, her strength returned. "Mrs. Blackwood," the lawyer asked gently, "your late husband, Silas Blackwood, was he aware of these events?" Clara took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the hostile faces of her former in-laws. This was the moment of truth, the final betrayal of the name and the life that had imprisoned her. "My husband was a meticulous man," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He knew everything that happened in that county. He knew the accusations against Eli were convenient. He knew Deputy Finch was a corrupt man, and he knew that with Eli gone, my family would be desperate enough to accept his marriage proposal." "Are you suggesting your husband was part of the conspiracy?" the prosecutor roared, jumping to his feet. "I am suggesting," Clara replied, her eyes flashing with a fire they had not seen before, "that my husband was a man who recognized an opportunity. He saw a man's life being destroyed, and he used that tragedy to acquire a young wife and secure a business alliance. He did not create the lie, but he profited from it, and he was content to let an innocent man rot to maintain it. She had done it. She had exposed the quiet, rotten hypocrisy that lay beneath the town's respectable facade. She had implicated her own late husband, a man revered as a town father, and in doing so, had severed her last tie to her old life. Jebediah Thorne's face was a mask of purple fury. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict came back, not guilty. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled Clara's knees washed over her. Eli stood in the dock, his face pale, as the judge formally exonerated him. But the victory came with a caveat. "Mr. Eli," the judge said, his voice grave, "while this court finds you innocent, the passions in your home county run deep. The men you have exposed have friends and family. For your own safety, and for the preservation of the peace. This court's pardon is granted on the condition that you leave this state and do not return." It was an exile, but it was an exile into freedom. As they left the courthouse, the crowd parted. The faces of Jebediah and his cronies were filled with a venomous hatred that promised retribution. But other faces were different now. A few of the townswomen, who had once whispered behind their fans, now looked at Clara with a new, grudging admiration. They saw not a sinner, but a woman who had fought for her love with a courage they could not imagine possessing. They did not return to the farm. Clara sent word to a lawyer to sell the property and all its contents, the proceeds to be wired to a bank in a different state. She had no desire to set foot in Redemption ever again. The house, the land, the furniture, they were all artifacts of a life that was no longer hers. All she needed from that life was the man standing beside her. 1 week later, with the dust of the capital behind them and a modest sum of money to their names, they bought 2 sturdy horses and supplies. They were starting over with nothing but each other. The final image the state of Texas would ever have of them was of 2 figures on horseback, riding west. They rode not with haste, but with the steady, unhurried pace of people who had nowhere to be but together. The sun was setting at their backs, casting their long shadows before them, painting the vast, open prairie in hues of orange and deep purple. Eli reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his, a silent promise in the twilight. They were leaving the ghosts and the lies behind, riding toward a horizon that held no guarantees, only a future they would finally face as one. A year passes like water flowing over stone, slowly smoothing the sharpest edges of memory. The harsh red dust of West Texas was a world away, a half-remembered dream. They had ridden west until the landscape softened, until the flat, unforgiving plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with oak and cottonwood, a land that promised a little more and demanded a little less. Here, on a well-traveled road that led to the gold fields further north, they had used the last of Clara's money to buy a small, sturdy way station, a few rooms for travelers, a corral for horses, and a kitchen that was always filled with the smell of brewing coffee and baking bread. They called it the Wayfarer's Rest. Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by fear and survival, but by the steady, quiet work of building a future. The perpetual shadow that had lived behind Clara's eyes for a decade was gone, replaced by the soft, steady light of a woman who was finally home. She no longer wore black. Her dresses were of simple, colored calico, and they could no longer hide the gentle, growing swell of her belly. She was carrying Eli's child. The gaunt, haunted widow had vanished, and in her place was a radiant, smiling woman, her hands dusted with flour, her laughter a frequent and welcome sound in the small inn. Eli, too, was a transformed man. The hunted, watchful tension had finally left his shoulders. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. He was a husband, a provider, an innkeeper. He chopped wood, mended tack for weary travelers, and told quiet stories by the fire in the evenings. The ghosts of his past were finally laid to rest, and in their place was a deep, abiding peace that seemed to radiate from him. He was a man who had been given a second chance at life, and he cherished every simple, unremarkable moment of it. One hot afternoon, as the sun beat down on the dusty yard. A lone rider approached. He was a stranger, but he had the familiar look of a man who had seen too many miles, lean, weathered, and covered in the dust of the trail. He dismounted, ordered a meal, and sat at a corner table, quietly observing them as they worked. Clara felt a faint, familiar prickle of unease, a ghost of her old fear. But she pushed it down. That life was over. After the man had finished his stew, he pushed his chair back and looked from Clara, her condition now obvious, to Eli, who was wiping down the counter. "Pardon me for staring," the traveler said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "But your faces are mighty familiar. It would have been a long time ago. West Texas, maybe." Eli's hand stilled. He turned slowly, his expression calm, neutral. "Could be," he said. "We've been a few places." The man squinted, his memory clicking into place. "That's it," he said, a slow dawning in his eyes. He wasn't malicious, merely curious. "I remember now. You're the woman, the widow Blackwood. And you," he looked at Eli, "you're the outlaw they ran a trial for, the one they said was a traitor." He shook his head, a low whistle escaping his lips. "Heard you two lit out of the state after the verdict. Weren't you two run out of West Texas?" The air in the small room grew still. The question hung there, a relic from a buried world. Clara's hand went instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture. She saw a flicker of the old hardness in Eli's eyes, the defensiveness of a man long accustomed to accusation. But then it was gone, replaced by the quiet strength she had come to know so well. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, and looked the stranger squarely in the eye. "We were run out of everything, friend," Eli said, his voice even and calm, without a trace of bitterness. "We were run out of our homes, our names, and the good graces of decent folk." He paused, and his gaze shifted to Clara, a look of profound, unwavering love passing between them. "We were run out of everything," he repeated softly, "except for love." The stranger was silent for a long moment, taking in the scene, the determined man, the glowing, pregnant woman, the peaceful sanctuary they had built from the ashes of their old lives. He gave a slow, respectful nod, as if acknowledging a truth deeper than he had expected to find. He tossed a few coins on the table, more than enough to cover his meal. "Well," he said, standing and picking up his hat, "looks like you held on to the only thing that mattered." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving them in the quiet, sun-drenched room. That evening, after the last of the travelers had retired to their rooms, Eli and Clara sat on the porch in two rocking chairs, a habit they had fallen into. The day's heat was finally breaking, and a cool breeze whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. The sky was a vast, star-dusted canvas. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a familiar, comforting weight. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. "Do you remember that night?" Clara said, her voice a soft murmur in the darkness. "After you showed me the letters, the first night you stayed in the house." Eli turned his head, a gentle smile touching his lips. "I remember every second of it." "You said something to me," she went on, her thumb stroking the back of his hand. Afterward, you said I was your bride, forever." "And so you are," he whispered, squeezing her hand. "My bride, my wife, my whole world." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a feeling of peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. They had been through the fire and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole, in that harsh and unforgiving land they had left behind. Some loves were too fragile to survive the wind and the dust, but theirs, a love born in hope, tested by injustice, and forged in a crucible of loss and disgrace, had been strong enough to endure it all. It had been strong enough to endure death, dishonor, and the damnation of an entire world. The last light from the inn's main room cast a warm, golden rectangle onto the porch. The sound of a closing door echoed softly in the night. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his shoulder. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her hair. "The West took everything from me," he whispered, his voice thick with a decade of unshed emotion. "But it gave me back you. Thank you for listening to this story around our campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So drop a comment below and say hello. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the frontier. And be sure to share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey.